I see you from now.
Morning, John.
Good morning. How are you, sir?
Doing well.
I moved from Illinois and worked at RCA in Indianapolis. And then I was transferred out here from Indianapolis to Lancaster to Yeah, it was fun. I worked in engineering. So now here in Lancaster it was new product development. So it was all brand new products that I got to work with. I was really interested. Well, she was working for RCA in Indianapolis too, but then she quit there to go to GE. When I transferred out here, she came out here, and then GE bought RCA to get her back.
Morning, Rich.
Morning, sir. How are you?
I'm doing mighty fine. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well.
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
She had 34 years. Count RCA and Thomas, all of them.
How come she do late? Did you ever sleep?
Good morning.
Yeah. But yeah, mine got up my place like that 12 after. And
I'm sitting over here with John.
And I didn't go. I just
Good morning. Huh? That happens to all of us.
Wait till he walks up and tries to
There was a lot
talk
of
to me
puppies
next
out
week.
there.
See?
Yes, there was. We definitely having services today.
I've never sat on this side before.
It's just about the same.
Yeah, is it, you think?
Yeah, pretty close.
You know what? Save my seat. I'm going to get a Bible.
Okay.
I know where's the
There
Bible.
should be something in the back there.
Yeah.
Melva, could you get that door, please? Could you get that door, please? Thanks. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the class on the story of Israel. You can't hear me? No. Well, the mic doesn't work in here. So this is not amplified. This is just for the recording. I'll have to try to talk louder. Okay.
Do you have a microphone?
No, I do not. So anyway, welcome to the class on Israel, and as we've been going through this, and we'll learn more in the weeks ahead, it's a story of rebellion, failure, and renewal, how God has dealt with the nation of Israel. So if you were here last week, we'll do a quick review. We saw the transition between David, when David dies and Solomon becomes king. We found there was an attempted coup by one of David's sons. So Solomon becomes king, and he asks God for a discerning mind or an understanding mind. And from there on, he becomes known for his wisdom. And the Queen of Sheba traveled hundreds of miles to come and spend time to essentially pick Solomon's mind. And she was astounded. There was nothing that he couldn't answer for her. And when he becomes king, he takes the nation of Israel and divides it up into 12 distinct districts. And each one of those districts is responsible for supplying Solomon and his household 1 month each year. But we also found out that Solomon entered into an alliance with Pharaoh from Egypt, and he ended up marrying Pharaoh's daughter. And so God had asked his kings not to marry women from other nations. And I think we finished up reading about what really causes the downfall of the nation of Israel, and it is the fact that Solomon married women from other nations, and they convinced him that he should start worshiping their gods as well. So we'll get into more of that next week. But it dawned on me, I don't know that we ever talked about why the nation of Israel is called the nation of Israel. So if you take your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32 is where we see the origination of the name Israel. So I'm going to begin reading here, and I know many of you probably know this story. In chapter 32, verse 22, that night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." So I don't know if you have a footnote there in your Bibles, but Israel simply means he struggles with God. So Jacob now becomes known as Israel, and he becomes the father of the 12 tribes. So all of the 12 tribes that we'll be talking about more later are all descendants from the 12 sons of Jacob, or known as Israel. Now I'm going to do something today I don't normally like to do. We're going to be flipping back between Scriptures and Kings and Chronicles. So when I refer you to one, keep your finger there. We'll be going back and forth. And the reason that is we talked about originally, some of the things in Chronicles and Kings are very similar, but there are little differences in each story, so I want to pick some pieces from each of those books. So, having confused you with that, I want you to turn to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 7. So today we're entering into this new lesson. It's called A New Place to Worship, the building of the temple and Solomon's house.
What chapter was it again?
It's going to be 2 Samuel chapter 7.
Thank you.
So here God makes a promise to David, and we're just going to read the first 3 verses here. After the king was settled in his palace and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." So this is David talking, and he says, I have this wonderful palace, and God still is living in a tent. So Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." So David has in his mind here that he wants to build a temple to the Lord. So Nathan is essentially giving him the go-ahead to do that. But now we're going to go back over to 1 Chronicles. Chapter 22. So we're going to be beginning in actually the first verse of chapter 22. Then David said, "The house of the Lord God is to be here, and also the altar of burnt offering for Israel." So David gave orders to assemble the aliens living in Israel, and from among them he appointed stone cutters to prepare dressed stone for building the house of God. He provided a large amount of iron to make nails for the doors of the gateways and for the fittings, and more bronze than could be weighed. He also provided more cedar logs than could be counted, for the Sidonians and Tyrians had brought large numbers of them to David. David said, my son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house is to be built for the Lord should be of great magnificence and fame and splendor in sight of all of the nations. Therefore I will make preparations for it. So David made extensive preparations before his death. Then he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But his word of the Lord came to me, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You're not to build a house for my name because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies and on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel. So David is the one who has this concept of building this temple, and he plans to do it, and Nathan essentially says, well, then you go ahead and proceed with your plan. But God intervenes and said, no, David, you're not the one. Your son is going to be the one who builds the temple. So now we're going to go back here in verse 28, or chapter 28 of 1 Chronicles, and we're going to begin constructing the temple. So David has done all of the planning. He's collected a lot of the material. So in verse 11, then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the portico of the temple, its building, its storerooms, its upper parts, its inner rooms, and the place of atonement. He gave him the plans for all that the Spirit had put in his mind for the courts of the temple in the Lord, and all the surrounding rooms for the treasuries and of the temple of God, and for treasuries of the dedicated things. So here, essentially, David is giving Solomon a package. Here are the plans for how this is to be built. I've already started gathering the supplies to build this glorious temple. So he makes, over in chapter 29, here still in 1 Chronicles, we're just going to read very quickly here. In the beginning, what we see is that David starts giving a lot of his own personal wealth to build this temple. And if we jump over here in verse 6, the leaders, David and his people, have already put together this, we'll call it a building fund, if you will. And then in verse 6, then the leaders of the families, the officers of the tribes of Israel, and the commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, and the officials in charge of the king's work gave willingly. And this goes down here and itemizes all the things that the people gave. And it says, the people rejoiced at the willing response of their leaders, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. And then down here in the latter part of that, beginning down here in verse 10, David issues a prayer. So now then they've started creating this building fund that was generated by David and his people, and all the people have contributed. So now then David gives this prayer of thanks. In verse 14, but who am I and who are my people that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. So now they've collected all of they've got the plans, they've got the materials, they've collected money, and so it's time to begin construction, and he gives thanks to God for the benevolence of everybody involved, but it acknowledges all that we have, we know, came from you. So before construction begins, an interesting things happen. Solomon has to start assembling a workforce to do this. And we're going to talk a little bit about Hiram, who is called the king of Tyre, which is in Lebanon, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But Solomon goes to Hiram and says, I need some help. So in chapter 2, verse 7 of 2 Chronicles. So Solomon is asking Hiram, says, "Send me therefore a man skilled to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, and in purple, crimson, and blue yarn, and experienced in the art of engraving, to work in Judah and Jerusalem with my skilled craftsmen whom my father David provided." And said, "Send me also cedar, pine, and algum logs from Lebanon, for I know that your men are skilled in cutting timber there. My men will work with yours to provide me with plenty of lumber, because the temple I build must be large and magnificent. I will give your servants, the woodmen who cut the timber, 20,000 cores of ground wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil." So the first thing that Solomon needs is somebody who looks to me like a pretty well-rounded craftsman. He can do everything. So send me somebody down here to head up this project. So now then, you can keep your finger there. Go back to 1 Kings chapter 6. So in 1 Kings chapter 6, it tells us, in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple. So when you stop and think about the history of Israel, all the time that they spent in captivity in Egypt, it's been 480 years since they got out of Egypt. God has given them this land, and now after 480 years, they're going to get around to building a temple. So it's taken them a long time to do that. So in 1 Kings, if you go back chapter 5, 1 Kings, he starts assembling a workforce, and we're not going to read all of that. But he starts putting together the team, and it's thousands and thousands of people it's going to take to build this temple. Interesting thing in 1 Kings chapter 6, which is where they start building this. Just skip down to verse 7, and I found this interesting. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. When you stop and think about the magnitude of that, and when you see the size of some of these stones that were used in the temple, how they did this remotely, and then hauled it there, so there was no sound of quarrying dealing the stone near the side of the temple. Now the other thing that happens here is, you've heard of the cedars of Lebanon. We're going to go back to 2 Chronicles now, and again I told you to keep your fingers there. We're going to be in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. So this is when he's entering this agreement with King Hiram. But down in 15 it says, "Now let my Lord send his servants the wheat and barley and the olive oil and wine he promised." This is Hiram talking. "And he will cut all the logs from Lebanon that you need, and will float them in rafts by sea down to Joppa. You can then take them up to Jerusalem." I don't know if you're familiar. Are you familiar at all maybe with that geography? It'd been nice maybe if I had a map. But this Lebanon is the same Lebanon that we see today, same country. Tyre, he was called the king of Tyre. Tyre is still a city in Lebanon. And they would have to float these logs, as near as I can understand, partially by sea and then by river, to get them to a place where Solomon's men can haul these cedar logs over the mountains into Jerusalem. So when you step back and take a look at the magnitude and the planning that had to go into just to get everything in one place to build this temple, it's impressive. Now, an interesting thing about this, when we talk about Lebanon, today it's in the news. Do you know how it's in the news today?
The wars.
The war. So You may have read in the paper today, or actually over the last few days, about Hezbollah. Do you know anything about them? They're essentially an anti-Israeli terrorist group, and they are in the country of Lebanon. And they are the ones that have been shooting rockets into Israel. So from Lebanon, from maybe around the same place where Tyre was, they're firing rockets into Israel. And if you read, Jim Bledsoe and I were just chatting about this. I don't know if you noticed this week, the way the Israelis responded was they were able to get a shipment of pagers that were coming in and put explosives into those pagers. And with the push of a button, they exploded all these pagers and killed a lot of people. So it's still the same two countries. It's Lebanon, where King Hiram was, and Israel, where the temple was built. So that history continues. So just thought I would put that out to kind of bring it up to date. So it turns out that when they build the temple, it's exactly twice the size of the tabernacle. Now, what do we know about the tabernacle? When I say tabernacle, does that bring anything to mind?
It's the tent that they carried in the wood in the wilderness. After they had gone from Mount, what's the name of the mountain?
Sinai. Yeah. So God had asked Moses to make sure they built this tabernacle. So it was a portable worship center, if you will. And so they carried that with them as they went through all their travels in the desert. And so the tabernacle looks something like this. So this is a picture of a model of the tabernacle, and if you can go back and read about the details in the book of Exodus. But it was put together according to God's plan. And in the center of this tabernacle, in the back, you can see a cloud over that. Okay? What was that supposed to signify?
Trip there.
Yeah, I know. What does that signify? God's presence, and that will become important when we talk about the temple. So it's exactly twice the size. Now, one of the questions that comes up, and we're going to read a little bit more about this, but one of the questions comes up, what happened to the tabernacle? And does anybody know? If you know, raise your hand. If people would like to. Pardon me?
I thought when they built the temple, they didn't continue the tabernacle.
Well, that's true, but the tabernacle had been lost somewhere. We don't know what happened to it. There's something in the book of Jeremiah that implies that maybe it was taken captive. But the tent and all of those things that were part of the tabernacle no longer exist. All that we have now is the Ark of the Covenant. So this is the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant, we believe this is the very same one that was in the tabernacle. I don't know if you know the story or not of the Ark of the Covenant. It was supposedly to represent God's presence. And it was captured one time by the Philistines. And when they got it, a lot of bad things started happening to them because of what God was doing. And so they wanted to get it back to the Israelites. So rather than try to pick it up and carry it, they actually put it on a cart that was pulled by a donkey or something and let a cow. I think I was going to say cow. And they had it pulled back to the Israelites and said, we had this, but we no longer want it. You can have it back. So now it's in the possession of the Israelites. Do we know, does anybody remember what was in the Ark of the Covenant?
I know the Ten Commandments.
Aaron's rod.
Okay.
Manna.
Manna. So we're going to take a quick look. I'm not going to read these scriptures, but depends on where you look as to what is in the tabernacle. In the Ark of the Covenant. Exodus 16, God tells Moses this manna. So apparently there was a golden jar of manna in there. And the stone tablets. Numbers says Aaron's rod. Aaron had the rod that budded. That was put in there. If you take a look at Hebrews chapter 9, we won't take time to do that. It says that all that was in there was manna, Aaron's staff, and stone tablets. And in 1 Kings, it says only the stone tablets. So we don't know if these things were put in and taken out randomly or what happened to them. But the Ark of the Covenant is important here. And we're going to find out all is in there now are the 2 stone tablets. So here's the thing that's important. Take your Bibles and turn to 1 Kings chapter 8. 1 Kings chapter 8. So, they've got the temple completed. It's time to move on and start bringing in the things that they want to be put in the temple. So in chapter 8 of 1 Kings, beginning in verse 1, then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the men of Israel came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priest took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all of the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about them were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place, and they're still there today. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So when we took a look at God's presence over the tabernacle, over the Holy of Holies, now that the temple is complete and they've brought in the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence fills the temple. So they now know that God is there. But over time, things change. The sin of the nation continues to increase. They continue to do things contrary to God's will. I want us to turn over now. We're going to flip over to another book, Ezekiel, and see what happens. We're going to look at Ezekiel 10. So Ezekiel is one of God's prophets to the nation of Judah. And he is constantly trying to tell them, you can no longer worship these other gods. You've got to return to the Lord. And we find out that they didn't. Jeremiah was one of God's prophets to Judah and tried to convince them to turn from your evil ways and come back to God, and they refused. So now we're getting to this point. They're into idol worship and all of these things that God asked them not to do. So beginning in chapter 10 of Ezekiel, I looked and I saw the likeness. Let me see which, I'm not going to read all of it. Let's just skip over to 18 and 19. I'm not going to have time for all of that. So In verse 18 of chapter 10 of Ezekiel, then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. While I watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of Israel was above them. So we're seeing now that the Spirit of God is given up on these people. Now His Spirit is leaving this new temple that was built for Him. So it's kind of a sad, sad story because of the rebellion of the people that God says, I'm through. My glory is no longer going to reside in this temple. So this is a model of Solomon's temple. Very impressive. And if you read some of the descriptions, it was a magnificent, magnificent building. Gold all over on the inside. A lot of these Lebanons of cedar. Apparently there was something unique about the cedar trees in Lebanon in the way that the branches grew out that made them a lot more manageable as far as woodworking. So this had a lot of cedar in it. We'll see that cedar was used in Solomon's house, in David's house, so it was very popular wood to be used there. So this was a magnificent facility, and it resembles, if you remember looking at the tabernacle, it resembles a bit. There's the altar out here, there's an entrance here, and you go through the holy place, and then the most holy place is in the back, is where the Ark of the Covenant is placed. So, again, a magnificent facility. We want to turn to Second Chronicles now, back to another piece I want to read, chapter 7. Second Chronicles chapter 7, we're going to be reading about 11 verses out of here. So the temple is completed, the Ark of the Covenant is in place, the people rejoice, they're thrilled. And then in verse 11, when Solomon had finished the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had succeeded in carrying out all he had in mind to do in the temple of the Lord and in his own palace, the Lord appeared to him at night and said, I've heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. When I shut up the heavens so that there's no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and will heal their land. This is a very popular verse. You may have seen on billboards, various places around the country, that God says, if my people will do these things, then I will hear from heaven and forgive their sins and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me as your father David did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man to rule over Israel. But if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I've given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land which I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. I will make it a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now so imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why he brought all this disaster on them. So after the thing is completed, God has this conversation with Solomon, says, I'm going to bless you if this nation will do these things. But if not, I'm going to take care of it, and I will destroy it. So we'll get into this next week when we start taking a look at what happens. Because of their sin and rejection of God, he allows the Babylonians to come into Judah, take a lot of people captive, and end up destroying this magnificent Solomon's temple because Solomon did exactly what God asked him not to do. Now, just real quick, 1 Kings chapter 7. Takes 7 years to build this temple. And we'll just take a quick look at 1 Kings chapter 7. 1 Kings chapter 7. So I said we'd talk a little bit about Solomon's palace. So in verse 1 of chapter 7, it took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. So 7 years to complete the temple, 13 years to build his palace. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high, and with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. It was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3 facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames, and they were in front part in sets of 3 facing each other. I want to skip down to verse 8. And the palace in which he was to live, set further back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. So do you remember when we first started talking about Solomon? He entered in a military alliance with Egypt, married Pharaoh's daughter. Now then, it's been many years, but he's now building a similar palace for his wife, the Egyptian daughter of Pharaoh. Now, interestingly enough, archaeologically, we have no evidence at all about Solomon's palace. There is a place in Jerusalem that is called, some ruins called Solomon's Stables. And if you remember when we talked about the wealth of Solomon, how many horses and all that he had and the stables he had, there's some evidence that they may have uncovered some of his stables, but no evidence they have uncovered his palace. So I wanted to point that out since we had talked about him having this alliance with Pharaoh's daughter. So this is going to be eventually destroyed. So clarify a few things about the temple. When we talk about the temple, this is the first temple that was built by Solomon around 1000 BC, and the Babylonians come in and destroyed about 586. And if you remember, where was it built? What was important about where it was built?
Mount Moriah.
Mount Moriah, which is where what?
Where Abraham did Isaac.
Yeah, that's right. So if you remember the story, God told David after he sinned about taking the census, you go out and buy this planting field of Arunia, I think it was. That becomes the location of where the temple will be built. And that's where it is built. Sir, it's in Psalms it's called Mount Ziah. In 2 Chronicles it's called Mount Moriah, and it's currently known as the Temple Mount in today's language. So we're going to find out as we go into the next 2 lessons that even though they're taken into captivity, the king of Persia allows them to start to come back in waves, and they start to rebuild what has been destroyed of Solomon's temple. So if you start doing any study on this, you will read some things called Zerubbabel's temple, because Zerubbabel was one of the leaders who helped start the reconstruction of that temple. So it's really called the Second Temple. So you may see those terms used interchangeably. Some people then will also refer to the next one. So this Second Temple, it was refurbished temple that Solomon built. When we get into the 1st century, we find that King Herod, in order to placate the Jewish people, says, okay, we will rebuild your temple for you. We will rebuild that temple. So he took what they had started in the rebuild and did apparently an amazing job of refurbishing and expanding the temple. So that's referred to as Herod's temple, or some people will call it the third temple. I think it's a lot easier to remember Solomon's temple, first temple, and the second temple is also Herod's temple. So take your Bibles now. We're going to jump over to Matthew. This is almost like a Bible drill.
Aerobics.
Yeah, that's a Bible aerobics.
Yeah.
So we have now,
Where am I?
we're going to be in the beginning of chapter 24. So Herod's temple, this is the one that's rebuilt by Herod in the first century. I think it took him 46 years to get this temple built. And apparently it is a magnificent facility. So in Matthew 24, Jesus is at Herod's temple. When we talk about Herod's temple, that's where Jesus is. That's where Jesus went when he was a young man. So Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things, he asked? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Now there's another passage in Luke and there's one in Mark that talks about the beauty of this temple. And so the disciples are talking to Jesus. Apparently they're coming from or have crossed over the Kidron Valley and maybe at the Mount of Olives and look back. And it's amazing. And he said, well, let me tell you, there's going to be a time when all of those stones will be overturned. We're going to have to move along here. And that happens in 70 A.D. So here is a model of the Herod's temple in the old city of Jerusalem. I don't know, Steve, did you get to see any of that when you were there?
Quickly, not.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeff got to spend some time looking at this model. So I want to run through some slides quickly. So the Temple Mount, we talked about that. That is where the original temple was built. All of the temples have been there. So it's important, really, to three different religious groups around the world. The Jews, they say, the Jews today will tell you it is still our property because King David paid for it. And there's no evidence that anybody has done any kind of a property transaction to take it over. So the Jew says it is our property. That's where Abraham came to sacrifice Isaac. And the Muslims believe that same place, Mount Moriah, Temple Mount, is important because that's where Muhammad ascended into heaven. Christians say, well, it's important because that's where Jesus taught in the temple. And some believe that this is where Jesus will return. I don't know where you are on your end times theology, whether you're a premillennialist, a postmillennialist, or an amillennialist, but there are groups of people who think that the temple will rebuild there and Jesus will rule from this new temple site for 1,000 years. So this is the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall. And you can see the Temple Mount over here. This is the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall is not a wall from the temple. It is a retaining wall that was built around Herod's temple. So you can see it's also called the Western Wall, and you can see all of these Jewish people here. They go to, and it's called the Wailing Wall because the Jews go there and they cry and plead and wail for God to please come back and rebuild the temple. So it's, yes, sir.
You were talking before, and God left the temple. He went through like the eastern gate. And am I right that that's the gate they expect him to come back?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not too sure about that. But today, Today, that location is actually controlled by the Israelis, but you can only get access to that the Temple Mount itself, with approval of the Muslims. And here's an interesting picture. This is Elder Steve at the Wailing Wall. When was this, Steve? 5-6 years?
Yeah, I was trying to remember, probably 2017 or 18.
So you want to share anything about your experience there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just, the whole experience was an amazing blessing to me. And it put so much of what I'd read all my life in scale and perspective that I never imagined I would have a chance to do. But what struck me, I'm talking a man who I was with on this trip, who was a young Christian, was really, really moved by this experience. But what's interesting and that struck me at this was how packed it was, how you had to wait and turn to go to the wall. There was pieces of paper you could write your personal prayers on and stick them in the crevices of the wall. And the other thing that struck me was, and I'm interested you had that slide up there, how many different faiths were there at the same time, right? So there were Orthodox Jews, there were Christians, there were Muslims, all there for the same reason. And it was just so unusual to me. It struck out that all of us would be there and getting along just fine, even though we all had different perspectives on the scripture, but this was one unifying piece. And that was just very telling, very striking to me as I look around this crowd. The other thing is that the men and women had to go to separate parts of the wall. You can only see men here. There were different parts. The men could not mingle with the women. So Chris and I separated and would go up to this wall and be able to experience it and pray there separately. So it was just, and in just the whole sense of scale, when I stood there at the temple and looked around, I kept going to when Jesus was tempted by Satan, and and I kept looking at this thing, and it's like Jesus was at that corner or that corner, the tallest corner of the temple, where he was tempted to jump, right? And so all those things come, you don't think about it, but it all comes back to mind when you're experiencing the spaces. So it was just a really wonderful blessing.
I want to run through 2 or 3 quick slides, but just give me a minute. Today, there are a group of Jewish people who are expecting the temple to be rebuilt. They're already collecting materials. They have a group of men who are designated to be priests in the new temple, and they get together regularly to practice all of the rituals that they'll have to do in this new temple. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, there's also a group of Christians, again, depending upon you where you're on in times, also believe that there's going to be a temple rebuilt there. So we have 2 different groups thinking that the temple is going to be rebuilt on that same location, to the point that they're already making things that are going to go into the temple. And these are what they call wine and water libation cups. They have tried to already make these based upon the best description they have, not only from the Bible, but based upon Jewish history. So they're making things that are going to go in there. If you were to go down through the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem, you will see this, and this is the menorah that is already built, that is supposed to go into the 3rd temple. So you can actually go see it, and there's a placard there and say this menorah is going to go into the 3rd temple when it's rebuilt. So it looks about like that. So there's our groups already taking steps in preparation for the building of the 3rd temple. All right. That was kind of a fire drill there at the end, but thanks for your attention. Next week, I want you to read 1 Kings chapter 11 and chapter 12, and then we will get into more detail about what happens to the downfall of the nation of Israel. Thank you very much.
I don't know if you saw earlier this week, the UN voted to make Israel get out of the old city of Jerusalem. And they're supposed to return everything back to the Palestinians. And it's just the old section of the city.
I did not see that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
That, the old city has the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in it. So, should be interesting.
It should be. That's what the developments over there are always interesting, fascinating.
And they got rid
Oh, very good, Angie.
I play music or watch movies.
Until they fall asleep.
I'll do that.
But she made
So he said he's I said, I'm doing good. How about you? How about the family? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a constant battle, and you're relying on the college students up and ready to field, yeah.